So the question is, can you use your clothing as a shelter in a survival situation? Well, my name is Davin Sunduk with The Catch Today, and I intend on answering that question and a variety of others in our shelter video, which is going to be skill number 9 of 12 survival skills that everybody needs to know. Now, I'm creating this video series because I was actually stuck in the wilderness, had to get rescued, and I hope that you never have to deal with that type of a situation. But if you do, I hope that one of these survival skills helps you actually survive and overcome a situation like that. And so if this video can just help one person, please give it a thumbs up and comment down below how we can help get this information and help as many people as possible. If you think a part 2 is needed or some expansion is needed on this topic, I'd be happy to help. So with that being said, let's get into some of the basics of a shelter and straight up answer the question, is your clothing an important piece of your shelter? The short answer is yes, but it's not the only part of your shelter. You see, your clothing is on you at all times. It protects you from both the heat and from the cold. A lot of people really underestimate the benefit of your clothing protecting you from the heat. So never underestimate a good long sleeve shirt. Now, this is a long sleeve fleece. It wouldn't be my preferred thing to wear in the summer, but a good lightweight summer shirt that is designed to breathe and protect you from the sun can be invaluable, especially compared to a t-shirt. So, since most deaths due to weather-related issues are from the cold, we're primarily going to be focused on the cold in this video. If you want a separate video for me talking about the warmth, or excessive heat, or how to protect yourself from the heat, I do live in the desert in Las Vegas, and I do a ton of stuff outside, and I'd be happy to share with you on how to protect yourself from the heat in a survival situation. But video for a different day. So without any further ado, let's get right into the meat and potatoes of this content. So when it comes to a survival shelter, there's going to be two main factors, and that's going to be keeping the wind off of you and keeping dry air close to your body, or just air in general trapped close to your body. So that's going to be the insulation factor of your gear. The second most important factor is going to be to stay dry. Now, why is staying dry the second most important factor? A lot of people think it's number 1, but it's actually number 2. Main reason is because there are materials out there that can keep you warm even when you're wet. I'll give you an example. Now, this is a completely separate situation, but I was out goose hunting once and fell through the ice. The ice was not deep, right? I was walking in an area that I knew was shallow ice, and I fell through the ice and I tripped forward. I was only in maybe mid-thigh high water, but I fell forward and some water got in between my bib and the rest of my chest waders. So even though I was only in thigh-high water, my chest waders were not able to protect me because I fell forward. So my neoprene waders actually provided enough insulation where my body heat was able to warm up the water that got into the waders, and I was just fine. Now, by the time I walked to the truck, I was pretty chilly, but that's because I took off a bunch of other gear in order to get back to my truck. But in general, yes, you can be warm and wet at the same time. It's way better than being cold and wet, right? So you do have to understand your gear. Now, if your gear can't handle being wet and insulating you, or you don't know, then assume it can't and stay dry at all costs. But keeping that insulation factor in mind is the most important thing, because you can't insulate yourself if you don't have anything to insulate yourself with, right? So if you have dry layers, keep them dry at all costs. So by doing that, we're going to be making sure that if we do have wet clothes and we have dry clothes, we don't contaminate them together, right? And also, we're going to treat our entire clothing and sleep system like one entire system, which means I do not walk into my dry shelter with my wet clothing, right? Unless my entire shelter is designed to keep me warm and wet. Now, I would argue that very, very few shelters are designed to keep you warm and wet. Some clothing can keep you warm and wet, but very few shelters are designed to keep you warm and wet. So your goal is going to be to dry yourself before you get into your tent. You're better off being naked inside your nice warm sleeping bag, on top of an air mattress, inside of a tent, protected from some trees, than you are trying to have that little extra insulation from your neoprene waders or from your polyester clothing. Yes, polyester clothing can be great at keeping you warm when it's wet, but not as good as making your cotton sleeping bag wet, because that's going to be way more important. So with that being said, we understand our gear. We understand that insulation is important and that staying dry is really important. There's going to be some location factors to a shelter that's going to help keep you dry. Now, we always have to balance this with other factors, right? So we always want to make sure we're preventing injuries. We can't be just camping at the top of a hilltop just for the sake of being dry. If there's no evidence that a low valley that is near your vehicle has ever had water in it or has never had water running through it, and it's above an area where there's obvious drainage and obvious water running through that area, I would much rather be close to my vehicle and 10 feet above the bottom of a drainage than, a half mile away from my vehicle and 200 feet away from the bottom of a drainage. Some reasonability does have to go through your mind and say, what is more safe? And for me, in the situation that I was in, I was very close to the bottom of the drainage. As a matter of fact, I was probably only 15 feet above the river line, which some people would say is dangerous. But when you have an icy, rocky slope that is a quarter mile to the top of it, I would say that I made the safer move, 100%. And I'm here today to talk about it. So I'm not saying that that my campsite was impossible to flood. It was definitely possible, but there was no rainy conditions, nothing to indicate that the water had ever been that high before where I was camping. And safe to say, I was pretty safe by doing that. So you do have to use some discretion when choosing a camp location. However, if you have the option, I didn't have this option, but if you have the option, find a bench. A bench is a landmark that is a flat spot between a valley bottom and a hilltop. So you got a hilltop, you got a valley bottom, and in between there, you have this little flat spot right before the valley bottom. Oftentimes there's going to be a lot of trees there and really thick, heavy brush. That brush is going to insulate you, and those trees are going to insulate you from the wind incredibly, and you're not going to have any risk of flooding, mostly in these areas. Now, is there some risk of flooding? Always, but very, very low chances of flooding in these areas. So they're going to be great places to stay dry and protected from the wind. Now, if you found one of these areas and you've got some wind protection from the trees, next is your tent or your immediate shelter, right? I would actually focus most of the attention on your mattress, since that's going to keep you the most warm at night. However, your tent or your general covering that's most immediate to your bed or most immediate to where you're going to be laying down, anything that blocks the wind out is going to be better than nothing, right? And in rainy conditions, you're always going to want to make sure that you can keep the water off you. So in rainy conditions, you're going to have to focus more on that top cover to make sure that the water gets pushed around you, and that way rain is not making its way through your shelter. But in extremely cold, dry scenarios, that's not going to be the main problem. The main problem is going to be that insulation underneath you, which is the situation that I was in. But anyway, take your situation with a grain of salt, look around you, be conscientious, and understand that if it's wet, having cover on top of you is more important. If it's dry, having cover underneath you is important. If you have the time, build cover on both. The next thing is your sleeping bag, right? So after your shelter is built, that's going to slow down the wind to a certain degree, right? Remember earlier in the video, we said that your clothing keeps wind and warm air close to your body. Well, that's all that we're doing here, right? We're creating an entire system to slow down the wind, right? So the trees will slow down that 20-mile-an-hour wind. Maybe not all the way down to 10 miles an hour, but maybe it's down to 12 or 15, right? Then your tent, maybe it won't slow down that wind all the way down to 1 mile an hour or 2 miles an hour. Maybe that tent, that wind in your tent, even from that 20-mile-an-hour wind, but maybe it's slowed down to maybe 4 miles an hour inside your tent, or maybe only 2 miles an hour. You never know. Next, we're going to go into your sleeping bag. Well, that 20-mile-an-hour wind that got cut down to 4 miles an hour in your tent, your sleeping bag is going to turn that almost into zero, and then whatever, maybe 1 mile an hour, and then whatever is closest to your body, that's going to be holding in that heat. So when you're in extreme cold situations, it actually can be a great idea to sleep in a base layer. I don't recommend sleeping in your jacket, because just in case you wake up sweaty, you do want to have the opportunity to get that wet clothing off you, potentially that wet blanket or that wet sleeping bag off of you, and get into a nice dry jacket. But if you absolutely had to, if you were cold and you were dry and you were shivering and you just were not warm enough in your sleeping bag, in your base layers and everything, put on extra layers until you do get warm, but do not get yourself sweaty. So those are all the tips that I have for you to stay safe in cold weather. If you got questions, comments, or concerns, give this video a like and a thumbs up. I really do appreciate it if it did help somebody. But comment down below, how can we get this video to help people? I'd be happy to create a part 2 to expand on any part of this video whatsoever. I do appreciate you for watching, and have a great day.